Today we're completing our overview of Byzantine history and we're tracing the development of the Byzantine Empire from 1204 to 1453. On the left is a mosaic from the late Byzantine period. We can see that in this mosaic there's more movement than we saw in previous Byzantine art, such as the famous mosaic of Justinian at Ravenna. And on the right is a modern artist rendition of what the border guards in southern Greece would look like in the 14th century, or maybe it's 15th, I'm not quite sure, as they defend against the oncoming Turks. So without any further ado, let's look at the last years of Byzantium. So let's rewind just a bit to the Fourth Crusade. At the conclusion of the Fourth Crusade, the leaders decided to divide the empire amongst themselves. And they assumed that they would be able to take over all of it, and they didn't really think about the possibility of Byzantine splinter states emerging. So originally they had a grand design, and that design kind of didn't quite work out the way that they wanted. So there's the Latin Empire, which is centered on Constantinople, the Kingdom of Thessalonica, the Duchy of Athens, the Principality of Nicaea, and the Duchy of the Archipelago. These are all states established by the veterans of the Fourth Crusade, and they are the Latin states. Different ones of them will have different historical destinies, and there also are areas which were annexed by Venice. We see those in green. Rhodes is taken early, and then they slowly reclaim other islands over time as they continue to be aggressive in Byzantine territory over the years. But the rest of these areas, those areas which seem to be in a pinkish color, some really hideous color, these fall under the control of native Byzantine dynasties. So different aristocratic families escaped from the capital or were already in place, and they asserted their power locally and set up resistance states. Let's look at all of those resistance states. But first, we're going to talk about the way that the Latins governed in their territories. Let's look at how the Latin lords governed their realm. So, when they would take over an area, the Latin lords would dismantle what remained of the Byzantine imperial administration and bureaucracy, and they would implement Western-style feudal arrangements. Now, we've already talked about how, under the Komnenoi and their successors, the Byzantines had already greatly weakened the central administration of their empire. However, there still was a somewhat effective tax collection system, and they had the pronoia system for raising troops. And since those get destroyed, this will pose a major obstacle later to actually effectively governing these areas, and maybe that's part of why the Latin lords have such a hard time. So the Latin lords made an effort to ingratiate themselves with the population, but this effort was almost completely unsuccessful. The reason why most of the common people were so adamantly opposed to Latin rule is that they thought of themselves as Orthodox Christians, and they did not accept Latin rites. So they didn't want church services conducted in Latin, which to them by this point was a foreign language that they had nothing to do with. They saw their native language was Greek, so they were not interested in hearing Latin. They also would have regarded a lot of these Latin lords as being barbarians with lots of pretensions to being Roman. There also were some aristocrats among the Byzantines who did cooperate for positions of power, but many of them also resisted or just stayed out of government and politics during this time. So the Latin governments didn't really have very strong local support, which meant that they needed some outside aid and new settlers and stuff like that. The problem is not that many people came from Western Europe to help them out. And because of this lack of support from either within or without, the Latin states really started to go into decline really quickly, and they were not able to sustain themselves in the long haul. Actually, Thessalonica, that whole state was gone by 1224. And it's fairly typical what happened to these states. They all got folded up pretty quickly, and they didn't really have any capacity to make a comeback because of their lack of support. When Constantinople falls in 1261, that's usually seen as the end of the Latin era. There actually are a couple of Latin rulers who last beyond that, but they're really, really small players, and they're not really worth mentioning. As I mentioned earlier, most of the splinter states of Byzantium were formed by aristocratic families who escaped Constantinople and set up power locally. Well, one family that managed to do this was the Comnenus family, the family that had ruled Byzantium for about a century and then had been overthrown by the Angli. Well, they were still around, and actually the grandsons of Andronicus I Comnenus escaped to the north coast of the Black Sea, an area that had been conquered by Manuel, if I'm not mistaken, and they set up shop in the city of Trebizond. And then they controlled the north coast of the Black Sea, and or not the Black Sea, but the north coast of what is now Turkey, along the Black Sea, and this became an area that they were able to hold for a very long time. Only one of the Comnenus family would be the ruler at any time, and therefore his title was the Grand Comnenus, as opposed to the other members of his family who were important, but they just weren't the Grand Comnenus. I guess, talk about family rule in its purest form. Maybe they were reviving the vision of Alexius I, who, had wanted his family to sort of rule all together with one person as more or less a figurehead. Anyway, so they are a major contender at first because they're pretty early to set up, but as they're trying to enter into the affairs of the main portion of the empire, they suffer a huge defeat at the hands of the Empire of Nicaea, one of their neighbors, and this basically eliminates them from contention, and after about 1220 or so, they basically just hang out on the coast of North Anatolia, and they're going to be there for a long time. And one of the things that really enables them to survive for so long is that they are protected by lots of rough terrain, and that the area that they live in is not really rich enough to attract the attention of too many super ambitious conquerors. One of the other three major Greek splinter states was the Despotate of Epirus, and this emerges in the Western Balkans in an area which corresponds with what was ancient Epirus, the home of Alexander the Great's mother Olympias. So, this area will be sort of free from Latin intervention because it's just simply too far away for them to try to settle, and that's really what allows it to form up in the first place. And it's then able to go on to be the state which conquers and destroys the Latin state of Thessalonica in 1224. However, once it makes its presence known, it ends up being exposed to a pincer attack from the other Latin states to the south and north of it, and they still have the Serbs in their rear. So the Latin emperors at Constantinople can engage in diplomacy and put Epirus in a lot of dangerous situations. So Epirus is weakened and doesn't have a lot of territory, and then the Empire of Nicaea, which is another Byzantine splinter state, will be able to march in, take Thessalonica, and then reduce Epirus to a very minor status for a long time. And actually, Epirus will have a pretty long period of independence, and that period actually kind of more fades away rather than ends in a clear way. So we won't really talk about it, but basically after they lose Thessalonica to Nicaea, which I think happens in the 1250s or so, they are basically done for as a major or important player, and at that point they're just one of the very minor powers in the far west. By far the most important of the Byzantine successor states was the Empire of Nicaea. So Theodore Lascaris, whose claim to power was being the son-in-law of Alexius III Angelus, was able to settle on the eastern side of the straits, and he was able to capture the important city of Nicaea. And from here, he was able to declare himself emperor in 1206 after the Latin emperor had to withdraw. So that had given him enough of a breather to really establish himself and get things going. The thing that really made Nicaea was that they were steadily growing from 1206 forward and gaining a lot of territory in Asia Minor, which was, of course, one of the Byzantine heartlands. And the Mongol invasions of the 1240s, which wrecked a lot of Eastern Europe, left Nicaea unscathed. So this meant that their neighbors had become weaker in relative terms, while they had, by virtue of having their neighbors weakened, become stronger. So now they're able to launch an invasion of Europe. And this enables them to defeat a combined alliance of the Latin Empire and Bulgaria. The Latin Empire was in deep decline, and Bulgaria had been wrecked by the Mongols. So the Empire of Nicaea is able to beat that coalition. In 1259, the one of the Lazarus emperors had died, and he had a young son on the throne, so he had to have a regent, and that guy's name was Michael Palaeologus, who quickly becomes Michael the Eighth, and then squeezes out the young child to found his own dynasty, the Palaeologus dynasty. And it will be this Palaeologus dynasty which will rule this new Byzantine state until its fall in 1453. So in 1260, Michael VIII decides to make a move on Constantinople, and he begins laying siege. In July of 1261, after several months of siege, the guards got tired of dealing with this, and they opened up the gates of the city, and the Byzantines were able to re-enter Constantinople. So now we see that the Byzantine Empire in its full form is back, and under Michael, he will spend a lot of time securing his position in both the east and the west. We see here that he's able to reconquer most of the northern Balkans up until the borders of Serbia. He's not able to finish off Epirus, and the Latin states are also able to survive for quite a while. However, we do also see that there's a Byzantine presence in southern Greece centered around the city of Mistra, and that will become important later on, as this will become one of the key heartland areas of the Byzantine Empire in its late age. So at this point, though, under Michael, who ruled from 1259 to 1282, things are looking up, and Byzantium is making progress on all fronts, and it looks like Byzantine history is repeating itself, and the empire is growing back to what it was after a period of decay. Because that's, after all, the pattern of Byzantine history. You have, a crisis, then you have a period of recovery, then a period where it's kind of at a good point, then a period where it's declining, then a crisis, another recovery, etc. And so far, there would be no reason to think that this wasn't in the process of happening. But when Michael dies, we'll see that things kind of don't go the way that they should. I guess the simplest way to put it is that after the death of Michael VIII, there were no more emperors who actually accomplished anything of substance. Most of his successors were lackluster, and to sort of defend them just a little bit, the problem was that the state was not as strong as it had been in earlier periods, partly due to the influence of the long time under the Komnenoi, who weakened the central government, and then partly due to the wreckage of the state by the Latins, who tried to set up a Western-style feudalism. So because of this, the administrative apparatus is still a shambles, and it's really hard to collect revenue or raise troops in the provinces that Byzantium controls. So one thing that they can do is try to hire mercenaries with the money that they do have. So at one point, they're trying to arrest the momentum of the Turks in Asia Minor. And by this point, we're talking about the Ottoman Turks. By this point, they are actually a thing, once we get to about 1300 or so. So the Byzantines hired the Catalan company of Almogavars. I think that's how you pronounce it. Almogavars. Almogavars. There we go. That sounds right. And when they hired these guys, they were fighting the Turks. Then eventually, this company decided to turn traitor when the pay dried up. And then they invaded Europe and the company of the Turks, and they laid waste to Byzantine territory. Partly this is because under Andronicus II, Michael VIII's heir, the empire really wasn't able to raise money. So to try to save money, he did things like disband the fleet. And then that caused further problems because now he's completely dependent on his friendship with Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa to have naval transportation or naval protection. And eventually Andronicus, because he devalues the currency and allows the Catalan company to lay waste to his own territory and all that kind of stuff, he's actually overthrown by the son of one of his co-emperors. And this is sort of just emblematic of how bad things have gotten and how feeble Byzantium has become. At this point, it's more or less a paper tiger. However, you can actually get away with being internally weak and disorganized so long as all of your neighbors are in similar shape. But the problem is everyone else was getting stronger and more organized, and they were able to campaign more because they had better and improving finances. So Venice and Genoa were predatory lenders towards the Byzantines. So the Byzantines were always strapped for cash, and they would turn to their Italian allies for money. The problem is, when the Byzantines couldn't pay, and they never could, To make up for the lack of payment, the Venetians would then seize islands in the Aegean, which meant that Byzantium got weaker and less able to raise revenue. And at the same time, they needed more money, so they take out more loans, and this became a vicious cycle. At the same time, we've already mentioned the Ottomans are now a thing. Osman founded the Ottoman dynasty in northwest Anatolia. This was part of the wreckage of the former Sultanate of Rum. And many of the early Ottomans who followed Osman and his early successors seem to have actually been Byzantines who converted to Islam. Now, this is a bit controversial. They may have just been regular Turks, but it looks like some of them were actually converted Byzantines. And that would actually explain a lot about how the Ottomans really take up a Byzantine-esque identity from an early stage. And in fact, when we talk about the Ottomans, we'll see that they claim themselves to be the Third Rome. At any rate, by the 1380s and 1390s, the Ottomans are completely dominant in the Balkans. They overrun Thessalonica in 1387, and they're also able to defeat a crusading effort at Nicopolis, which was launched by Western and Eastern European powers in 1396. And after that, the Ottomans continued to expand fairly unabated. We'll talk about one little reprieve that the Byzantines got, but ultimately this will be a stay of execution and not a change of sentence. Poverty has always been an obstacle to waging war effectively. However, by the late Middle Ages, it will be even more of an obstacle than it was before, because now we're seeing a revolution in the way that wars are fought. Gunpowder weapons had originated in Europe around 1300 or so, and by 1400 they'd actually become effective, and they were something that you actually needed if you wanted to compete. So the thing is, because these weapons are still relatively new and they're constantly improving, the inventors and manufacturers who make them have to make money off them, because these things cost a lot of money to manufacture, takes a lot of skilled labor, takes a lot of really expensive parts and precious metals. And many of these inventors and manufacturers are Christians who live in parts of Eastern Europe, and they're interested in giving these things to the Byzantines so they can use them to defend themselves against the Turks. The problem is the Byzantines have no money. So they'll present their weapons at the court of Constantinople, and the emperors will basically say, this is really cool, you should donate it as a good Christian. And these inventors say, well, maybe I'm not that good of a Christian because I have bills to pay. So anyway, that obviously does not favor the Byzantines, and everyone around them is arming up with cannons and handguns and all that kind of stuff. And the real danger is that one thing that Constantinople had always had throughout the Middle Ages that had made it really hard to take is that it had really formidable walls that were hard to penetrate. Now, although these walls were 1,000 years old, the design was still good. The problem is, once you have high-powered artillery, stone walls are totally useless. So, as these cannons get bigger and better, Constantinople becomes more and more outdated. So this is a major obstacle. And because they're having a lot of trouble fielding men because their recruitment system was destroyed, they have to rely heavily on Italian allies who are not reliable. Italians in the Middle Ages were the mercenaries par excellence, and their first priority was making money, so they're not as dedicated to the Byzantine state as, say, the old thematic armies or even the pro-Noia armies had been. So Byzantium is less well equipped in terms of its technological levels in comparison with their enemies, and their men were less motivated and less numerous. So as you can imagine, this is not good. So by 1400 or so, Byzantium was in really terrible shape, and the only thing that really remained was the city of Constantinople and its immediate environment. Greece, mostly the Peloponnese, what becomes known as the Morea at this time, and a couple of islands here or there. But for the most part, most of these islands had been repossessed by the Italians. So we're looking at an empire that consists primarily of Constantinople and the Peloponnese. And Out east, the state of the Trebizond under the Komnenoi was also being greatly reduced and stranded, and it was not even in contact at this point with the main Byzantine world. The things had gotten so bad after the disbanding of the Byzantine navy that the Paleologus authorities had to actually get rides on Italian ships to get from the Morea to Constantinople. Now, as for the Morea itself, as I said, this is the new name for the Peloponnese, and what happens is that this becomes a despotate. A despot apparently is a rank lower than emperor that still denotes some sort of executive authority. At any rate, this is a semi-independent area in Greece which will be under the princes, so the brothers and sons of the reigning emperor, and the capital will be at Mistras, which is about 5 miles from the ruins of ancient Sparta. And by this point, the power in the Byzantine world has shifted enough that there is more manpower and wealth in the Peloponnese or Morea than there is in Constantinople itself. We'll see that Constantinople as a city has really fallen off a cliff in terms of its population and everything else. And it looks like this little rump state is going to get crushed in the early 1400s by Bayezid the Thunderbolt, the Ottoman ruler who was very ambitious and known for his generalship. But then he learned about Tamerlane being on his eastern frontier, so he took his army and headed east, and he lost a major battle in 1402. He was taken captive. His sons fought a civil war for control, so there's about a decade or two that's lost for the Ottomans. And the Byzantines are not able to capitalize because of their internal weaknesses, but they are given a reprieve, so they're not further destroyed. But, things continue to get worse after Bayezid's heirs get their stuff together and begin, making advances in the West once more. And by 1450, the Byzantine world would look like what you see on your map here. Just Constantinople and Greece. And even in the Morea, we see that the Italians have seized several things from the Byzantines. The last 2 or 3 Paleologus rulers would appeal to the West and mostly be ignored, but one major effort that was made on behalf of the Byzantines occurred in 1444, called the Crusade of Varna. This is where the kings of Poland, Hungary, and the voivode of Wallachia all gathered together and launched a grand assault on the European holdings of the Ottomans with the aim of booting the Ottomans out of Europe altogether. At first they were having some successes, but then they were defeated by the Ottoman army and forced to withdraw. And then the Ottomans inflicted a major defeat on the Serbians a few years later, and that more or less left the Byzantines stranded and without any form of aid. Now there was a new Ottoman Sultan who came to the throne at the age of about 21, named Mehmed II, who would ultimately become known as Mehmed the Conqueror. He would rule for 30 years, and his first objective to really solidify his power was to conquer Constantinople. So in 1453 he began laying siege, and even before that, for a couple years, he spent a long time building weapons and doing all that kind of stuff. Now, Constantinople's population had really fallen off a cliff by 1453. Partly this was due to the outbreak of the Black Death back in 1347, and Constantinople had lost half its population then, and the city, rather than recovering or becoming stable, had declined because of the increasing way that traders would circumvent Constantinople and go to other cities, which were part of more important powers like the Ottoman Empire. So the trade had dried up, and without the trade there wasn't really as much use for the city. And the total population isn't really known, but it is known that most of the city was uninhabited, so it was like the late medieval Detroit. At any rate, of the 7,000 men that Constantine XI was able to muster to defend his city, he had about 5,000 Byzantine natives and about 2,000 Italian sailors and merchants. So not a very inspiring force. On the other hand, Mehmed had probably at least 50,000 men, and he also had commissioned a bunch of cannons. In addition, his men were actually good. So, because Constantine is just calling up anybody who's remotely able-bodied. So a lot of these would be older guys or teenagers or whatever. So it's not really a fair fight, but the city of Constantinople, despite the fact that it's outdated, it's still pretty formidable, and the walls are thick. So even these massive cannons will take a while to reduce them. But in the end, Mehmed is able to win out, despite a really tough fight that should not have been as tough as it was. Constantine XI ended up dying in the fighting. His body was never recovered, and he became a sort of folk hero, and he still is celebrated in Greece to this day. There's actually a monument to him in Greece. In addition, his family, the Paleologi, would flee to England, and they would live there for about another 200 years, and then they would die out there, and there's a monument to them there. So that's kind of an interesting little fact of history. But anyway, let's get back to the other surviving areas of the Byzantine Empire and see what happens to them. So Mehmed was now Mehmed the Conqueror for his success in taking Constantinople. However, he was not content to rest on his laurels, and he would continue to conquer new territory throughout his life. And 2 of his conquests were at the expense of the other Byzantine splinter states. So, there were 2 Paleologan princes who were set up in the Morea, which, as we mentioned earlier, in the ancient world was known as the Peloponnesus. And this was an area which was able to self-sustain it after the loss of Constantinople, and is able to go on for several years without the guidance of an emperor at Constantinople. So Mehmed would invade in 1460, and then he'd leave his generals in charge, and they would finish off the last castle in 1461. There are a few accounts of this which make it look like the reason for the defeat of the Byzantine survival state in Morea is that the 2 Paleologus rulers were at odds with each other. But let's be realistic, even if there had only been one ruler of all of the Peloponnesus, there's still no way in hell that they would have been able to defeat Mehmed the Conqueror with his massive army. So it's kind of a weird way that people write about this. I don't understand it. It's just living in a fantasy world. Alright, and there's also out east the Trebizond. So this had been neighbors with the Ottomans for much longer. And for whatever reason, the last Grand Comnenus named David, also the first Grand Comnenus had a brother named David, so this is kind of like coming full circle, tried to rouse Western support, and he was calling for another crusade, but one that would be near him, rather than near Constantinople, which is obviously where it would probably go. And the Ottomans heard wind of this, and Mehmed was not amused. So after he left Greece, he took another army and marched into the Trebizond. But instead of directly attacking Trebizond itself, which was heavily fortified, he took out the neighboring state. So he conquered a Turkish state on one side, and then he conquered some sort of nomadic state on the other, which left Trebizond isolated. And then David saw the writing on the wall and surrendered in August of 1461. Another thing that's worth mentioning is Mehmed's efforts to repopulate Constantinople, which he now renamed Istanbul. So he spent lots and lots of time and resources encouraging immigration to the city. And by 1478, he had substantially repopulated the city, but to give you an idea of how depopulated it was going into that, there were still less than 20,000 households in the entire city. Even after two plus decades of the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, the most powerful man in this area, maybe in the world at this point, really encouraging immigration, the city is still not anywhere near what we think of as being an appropriate population level for it, the size of the city that's contained within the Theodosian walls. It would be quite a while before Istanbul would have the kind of population levels that Constantinople in its prime had. But Mehmed gets the ball rolling on that, and it will eventually reclaim that kind of status in the world. The last major contribution that the Byzantines made to the world was during this late period, when many Byzantine scholars fled to the west, especially to Italy, in order to avoid the chaos, earn a little money, and flee what was becoming an increasingly unfriendly intellectual climate. Now, as Byzantium continued to struggle with its foes, religion shifted away from the more intellectualized theology and shifted more towards this kind of emotional mysticism, which was not really something that you'd be into if you were a learned scholar. So many of them felt unwelcome, and there also was not really a lot of patronage anymore from the imperial government or anything like that. So this wasn't really the greatest place to be a scholar. So a lot of people are permanently leaving, others are just temporarily leaving. But at any rate, when they would go, one thing that they would do is they would teach other people Greek. Now, since the Renaissance at this time is starting in Italy, people are really obsessed with Greek culture. So these Byzantine scholars who are Greek experts are able to teach them the Greek language, and they're also able to expose them to Greek texts, especially Plato, and other things that really are now in vogue in the West. And as they flee to the West, sometimes they actually take these texts from libraries and monasteries and don't return them. So many of the manuscripts, probably most, that we have today originated in Byzantine libraries and monasteries, and then they were copied and preserved in Italy or France or somewhere like that. And this is also called the Second Byzantine or Paleologan Renaissance. And really what it is it's a sort of contribution of the Byzantines to the main Italian Renaissance, more so than a Renaissance in its own right. But it still gets that label anyway because people like to label as many things as humanly possible because it makes them sound really important and principled. So anyway, that is it for Byzantium, but there are still many other civilizations yet to be studied.